People will tell you that music is just background noise for your life. They are wrong. Music is an obsession. It's the reason I've spent 40 years standing in concert halls across Germany and Europe waiting for that one perfect chord to change my life. We're here to talk about the legends, the new blood, and the stories from the front row. We'll review the shows, argue over the albums, and probably tell you why your favorite band is actually rubbish, or why they're the greatest thing we've heard all year. Pull up a chair, get comfortable, and prepare to disagree with almost everything we're about to say. Enjoy our podcast series, Echoes Encore, brought to you by Awesome Tunes.
Awesome Tunes.
Right, today we're off to Bonn, to a park by the Rhine, to see a band who have somehow turned British chaos into a functioning art form. Madness, a group so gloriously themselves that trends, fashions, and the entire modern music industry can do one. Frank was there, he got in early, he got ideas, and what could possibly go wrong? Frank, tell us about it.
So, the 9th of July 2026, Bonn Open Air in a park near the Rhine. And before we even get to the music, let me say this. Every good concert story starts with either a brilliant stroke of luck or a minor crime. This one had both. I got there fairly early and was waiting outside with just a small handful of fans before entry opened. Now, I only had a regular standing ticket. No front of stage, no special early entry, none of that lovely little VIP-ish business, just the normal ticket, the peasant class, basically. When the gates opened, they first called all the front of stage people and the early entry ticket holders forward. They got their special wristbands, all very official, all very organized, all very German. Brilliant! Then those people were let in first, and by this point there was already a proper queue building behind us. But because I'd been there early, I was right at the front of the normal lot. So when our turn came, I was the first of the regular payers onto the site. Straight past the merch stands, straight past the food and drinks, because the problem is, people waste time making sensible decisions. I do not. I went directly to the barrier separating front of stage from the regular standing area. And there it was. Opportunity. Most of the front of stage people, having paid extra for the privilege, were doing the most predictable thing imaginable, buying beer and t-shirts. So the supposedly exclusive area at the very front was barely occupied, thinly populated, practically abandoned, and more importantly, there was no steward actually checking wristbands at that moment. So I thought, how hard can it be? And schwupps, as we say in Germany, I was in. Not only in, but right at the very front on the stage barrier. I'd done a thing. For the first part, I was still trying to hide my hand a bit so nobody would notice I was, let's say, socially upgrading my ticket. But later I realized quite a few others had copied my little campaign of liberation and were standing there without the proper band as well. Anyway, now, before Madness came on, there were two support acts. And support acts are usually a peculiar form of live entertainment because everyone in the crowd is there for the main act. The support band can work incredibly hard. They can be perfectly decent, but most people are thinking, yes, yes, very nice. Now bring on the band I paid for. The first support act were a German band called the Slapstickers, which sounds less like a cool band and more like a group of men who've been banned from a children's party for overcommitting to the clowning. And I'll be fair to them, they actually did a solid job. Musically, no complaints, plenty of energy, plenty of bounce, the sort of thing that works well enough in an open-air setting while people are still finding their places and deciding whether 14 euros for a drink is an act of commerce or armed robbery. What was slightly odd was that whenever they spoke German between songs, the whole thing drifted a bit too close to carnival band territory, not musically necessarily, but in tone. You know that feeling where it all suddenly becomes a bit too cheerful in a very local way. The good news is they were competent. The bad news is Some of the stage banter made it feel like one step away from someone producing a novelty hat. Still, they did an interesting version of Depeche Mode's Enjoy the Silence, which at least made me raise an eyebrow. Was it life-changing? No. Was it bearable? Yes. And sometimes, for a first support act, that's already a win. Then came The Lottery Winners, which is a fantastic band name, because if you're still doing support slots, one assumes the lottery winnings were perhaps not astronomical, although, to be fair, they've supported major acts before, and you can tell they know what they're doing. The funny thing is, if you looked at them before hearing a note, you might assume something completely different musically, maybe some sort of rap or hip-hop adjacent thing. But no, not at all. Visually, they don't really match the sound in the way your brain expects. The singer and guitarist, who looked like he'd escaped from a barber shop that specialized in beard wax and poor decisions, are, let's say, generously built. And once again, I found myself wondering why so many people let third-rate tattoo artists engrave fourth-rate doodles onto their bodies forever. But that is a separate tragedy. Musically, though, they were surprisingly good. Actually, more than that, they were genuinely refreshing. Catchy, lively, entertaining, and lifted nicely by the bassist's backing vocals, which from what I'd seen later are clearly a bigger part of the band's sound than you might expect at first glance. Apparently the gig was being filmed as well, possibly for a future video clip. So there's every chance my illegal front row adventure may now be preserved for posterity, which would be nice, or evidence. The only slightly awkward bit was that the frontman spent a lot of time trying to orchestrate the crowd. Clap here, sing there, jump now, do this, do that. And the problem is, he was playing to a German audience waiting for madness. That is not always the most naturally responsive combination for this sort of forced participation. He gave it a good go, but the results were mixed. At one point, when the crowd response wasn't exactly setting records, he more or less called it Scheisse, which, to be honest, was very funny. So overall, good comedy, good songs, better than expected. For a support act, 8 out of 10. No question. And then finally, the main event. Madness. Name absolutely the program. They came on after the song titles had run across the screen, which gave the whole thing a slightly theatrical build-up, and then they launched into one step beyond, because of course they did. It's what Madness do. Don't watch that, watch this, and off we go into the heavy, heavy monster sound. I had the slight impression that part of the original intro was trimmed down a touch, possibly because Suggs either didn't fancy doing all of it or simply couldn't be bothered to excavate the full text from wherever it now lives in his memory, but honestly, it didn't matter. From there, it was basically a greatest hits masterclass. Embarrassment, House of Fun, Baggy Trousers, Madness, Night Boat to Cairo, It Must Be Love, and of course, Our House. All the songs you want from a Madness show were there, which is exactly what should happen. This is not the moment for difficult artistic reinvention. Nobody has come to hear the experimental B-sides. They want the classics, and Madness know that. And then there's Suggs, real name Graham McPherson, who now looks less like the frontman of a legendary ska pop institution and more like a slightly disoriented gentleman who's wandered out of a racecourse bar and somehow ended up center stage. Even Suggs isn't real. It's a nickname he pinched from a jazz encyclopedia and then inflated into his own little myth, because of course he did. The problem is, beneath the suit, the sunglasses, and the air of someone permanently half amused by the world, he's always been gloriously unreliable. This is a man who was once nearly thrown out of Madness for going to football instead of rehearsal, later fell off a stage in front of 250,000 people while supporting David Bowie, and even managed to make a brief attempt at stand-up comedy sound like a medically avoidable incident. And yet somehow, that faint sense that anything could unravel at any moment is precisely what makes him such a compelling frontman. And in Bond, Suggs still comes out in a proper suit, which I like enormously. At this stage, though, it gives him less of a wild ska pop frontman look and more of a sort of British Frank Sinatra who's wandered into a highly organised musical riot. He wore his sunglasses throughout the whole gig and moved with those wonderfully odd robotic stage gestures of his, to the point where at times he looked like a blind man searching for his lost guide dog, which sounds cruel, but visually it was enormously entertaining. And that's the thing with Madness. They don't need to pretend to be young. They don't need to bounce around like they're 25. They're better than that. They know exactly who they are, exactly what this material does to a crowd, and exactly how to deliver it professionally. There were additional brass players and backing performers in gold shimmering jackets, which already looked suitably mad. And during one song, they briefly transformed into policemen and appeared to rough up the saxophonist as part of the onstage drama, which was ridiculous, theatrical, slightly daft, and therefore completely correct for a Madness show. As for the saxophonist, Lee Thompson, or Kix if you like, he's not just some overexcited man with a horn and a face full of mischief. Before Madness, he was already busy causing trouble in North London, and unlike many stage clowns, he actually helped write some of the band's most important songs, including Embarrassment, House of Fun and The Prince. So yes, there is a proper brain in there somewhere. On stage, however, he behaves like a sugar-fueled schoolboy who's escaped supervision, grimacing, winding up the crowd, chucking paper aeroplanes about and generally carrying on like attention is oxygen. It's funny for a bit. Then you start thinking, what could possibly go wrong? Especially when he's larking about near the edge of the stage looking as though he might fall 3 meters into the abyss. And honestly, an ambulance subplot was not on my evening wish list. Still, that chaotic energy is part of the whole Madness machine. It's polished but not sterile, silly but never amateur, and that's a difficult balance to pull off. Vocally, Suggs was absolutely still there. No major collapse, no sad nostalgia act, none of that. The voice has aged, obviously, because that is what voices do unless you're a vampire. But it still worked, still carried the songs properly, and still had enough character to make the whole set feel authentic rather than museum-like. The set length at roughly an hour and a half was also exactly right, long enough to feel satisfying, short enough that no one was looking at their watch wondering whether this would ever end. The good news is they know their limits. The bad news is I'm not entirely sure how many more little boxes there are left for me to tick with Madness, specifically because this was one of those bands I'd somehow never seen before and needed to. Now I have. Tick in the box, job done. So, overall, a really rounded concert, professional, funny, nostalgic in the right way, and still full of enough life to remind you why Madness became Madness in the first place. Not dangerous anymore, perhaps, not truly wild, but charismatic, sharp, and deeply unapologetically themselves. And honestly, in a park by the Rhine, standing illegally in front of a barrier I definitely wasn't meant to be behind, that felt exactly right.
That, to be fair, is how live music should work. A bit of skill, a bit of luck, a bit of nonsense, and at least one decision that would look terrible if written down officially.
Exactly. So if Madness is still on your list and you get the chance, go. Just maybe don't use my ticketing strategy as official advice. That was it. Next day I was off to see The Cure in Berlin. Stay tuned.